I told you to stay quiet.
And I apologize, sir, but there are some things that must be said from the heart. Love sees no uniforms.
The violins whispered through the hall, but the sound felt like ice against the heart. The wedding guests glided over polished marble floors, their laughter wrapped in pearls and pride. But in that moment, when Mr. Hawthorne's cold voice sliced through the air, everything stopped. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His words came low, sharp, meant to wound without leaving a mark. Do your job, and don't speak to anyone tonight, especially not my family. And he didn't look at her again. As if she were furniture, as if she didn't have a name. But she did. Evelyn, 53 years old, a woman who had carried other people's children on her shoulders while her own dreams quietly died in the corners of forgotten rooms. Her hands tightened around the silver tray she was holding, but her voice stayed locked inside. She nodded once because that's what years of service teaches you to do. Nod, obey, swallow your pride, but her eyes, they didn't bow. They trembled with a storm nobody in that golden room wanted to see. No one knew, or maybe they pretended not to. Evelyn wasn't just any maid. She wasn't just another uniform blending into the wallpaper of this rich man's world. She had raised his son, Michael Hawthorne, the groom, when his own mother was too busy attending fundraisers, when his father was traveling for business. It was Evelyn who stayed. Evelyn who held his hand through nightmares. Evelyn who clapped the loudest at his school plays, even though she had to stand in the back. She made his lunches, ironed his school uniform, whispered to him that kindness mattered more than money, but now here she stood at his wedding, and she was told not to speak, not to exist. The chandelier above sparkled like frozen tears. Evelyn stepped back into the shadows near the entrance, close enough to watch, far enough to be unseen. In her pocket, beneath the stiff white apron, her fingers brushed against the worn edges of a tiny locket. She didn't open it often, but tonight she needed strength. She clicked it open with trembling hands. Inside was a faded photograph, Michael at 7 years old, missing one front tooth, grinning up at her like she was the whole world. She snapped it shut quickly as footsteps approached. Guests filled the chairs, murmurs rising like distant thunder. Then the doors opened and the bride walked in, radiant in white silk and soft lace. Everyone stood. Evelyn didn't move, she couldn't. She stayed pressed to the wall, the locket burning against her skin. Michael stood at the altar, shoulders straight, trying to look like the man his father wanted him to be. But his eyes, they searched the room for something, or someone. They found her for just a fraction of a second. He didn't smile, didn't wave. But his jaw tightened. His eyes softened with something like guilt. He remembered. The ceremony began. Words about love and honor floated through the air, but they felt heavy, hollow. Mr. Hawthorne sat in the front row, hands clasped, jaw tight, pretending everything was perfect. But beneath that polished exterior was something darker, a fear that if people knew the truth, if anyone found out how much he owed a woman in a maid's uniform, his power would crack. So he silenced her, because silence was safer than gratitude. Evelyn stood still, like a ghost in plain sight, but inside her heart pounded against her ribs. Each vow Michael spoke felt like a thread pulling her back to every memory they shared, him running down the stairs, scraped knee bleeding, crying Miss Evelyn, her bandaging him, whispering hush, I'm here, him falling asleep on the couch, fever burning, her wiping his forehead through the night. And now no one in this room knew her name. She swallowed hard, forcing tears back. She couldn't cry, not here, not in front of them. She took a deep breath and stepped quietly toward the back table, refilling glasses, clearing plates no one had touched. They didn't look at her, they never did. But whispers started somewhere in the back, about the way Mr. Hawthorne spoke to her, about the way the groom looked at her with something like regret. A few guests noticed the locket. One woman frowned, eyebrows pinched, wondering, but no one asked. Then just as the priest lifted his hands to bless the rings, something happened. A small glass slipped from Evelyn's tray and shattered on the floor. It was barely a sound against the music, but for Mr. Hawthorne it was enough. His head snapped toward her, eyes like steel. The room went silent. The bride paused mid-step. Evelyn froze, breath held, and then in front of everyone Mr. Hawthorne stood. Leave, he said, voice cold as winter. You're done here. The words hit harder than any slap. The shame felt like fire crawling up her neck. For a second, no one moved. The violins stopped. The bride's lips parted in shock. Michael took a step forward, but his father shot him a warning glance. Evelyn looked at the floor, her throat tightened. She didn't plead, she didn't apologize, she simply nodded like she always did. But this time her hands shook. She turned to leave, one slow step, then another, but before she reached the door, a small voice broke the silence. "Wait, Michael," his voice echoed through the hall. His father's face turned crimson with anger. The bride looked between them, panic rising. Guests leaned forward in their seats. Michael walked toward Evelyn, each step heavy with 20 years of unspoken gratitude and hidden shame. And the room held its breath. The reception glittered like a lie wrapped in gold. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter bounced off marble walls. The bride twirled, her white dress catching every shimmer of the chandelier. But in the midst of all that beauty, Evelyn stood silent, invisible, refilling champagne flutes like she was part of the silverware. Guests brushed past her without a glance, except when they wrinkled their noses and whispered behind jeweled hands, "Why is the help standing so close to the family?" One woman scoffed, lifting her chin as if the air around Evelyn was dirty. Mr. Hawthorne heard. Of course he did. And instead of correcting them, he smirked, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "She forgets her place sometimes." Words landed like stones. A few guests laughed under their breath. Others sipped their drinks and pretended not to notice. But Michael, his smile shattered. His eyes found Evelyn across the room. Her face stayed calm, still like water before a storm, but her fingers, gripping the neck of a champagne bottle, trembled ever so slightly. She looked away, not because she was ashamed, but because she knew if she held his gaze too long, the truth buried in both their hearts would start to crawl to the surface. Hours passed in music and lies. People danced, toasting to love, to wealth, to the future. Evelyn moved through them like a shadow, a silent ghost haunting the home she helped build. No one saw how her feet ached beneath worn shoes. No one cared how many nights she stayed up sewing the lace on tablecloths for this very wedding. She was just part of the background, polished silver, pressed uniform, lowered head. When the crowd finally drifted toward the garden lights, Evelyn slipped into the hallway just for a breath, just for silence. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes. For a moment, no voices, no polished cruelty, just the sound of her own heartbeat. Then footsteps. Soft, familiar. "Mama Eve," Michael whispered. His voice was gentle, like when he was a boy again, tugging at her apron. "You okay?" She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Not tonight, child." She glanced toward the ballroom doors. "Your father wouldn't like it." He hesitated. He wanted to say more, to tell her he was sorry, that he didn't want her to feel alone in this house of strangers. But before the words could form, Mr. Hawthorne appeared at the end of the hallway. His presence turned the air cold. His voice was smooth, but sharp as broken glass. "She's staff," he said, staring at his son. "She serves, not speaks." The words cut deeper than he even knew. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Michael's fists clenched. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Years of his father's control pressed on his chest like a weight. Evelyn stepped back, placing a gentle hand on his arm. A simple touch that said, "Don't. Not here, not now." The billionaire gave a satisfied nod and walked away as if he'd just swatted a fly. The night went on, but something had shifted. Evelyn kept working, but her breaths were slower, heavier. Each laugh around her sounded emptier. The humiliation didn't sting like before, it burned, quiet, deep, like fire under cold ash. She had learned to survive this language of pain. It was the only one the rich ever spoke fluently. Then came the moment no one expected. The bride's mother, kind-eyed and slightly drunk on champagne and joy, wandered over to Evelyn during the toasts. She smiled warmly, thinking Evelyn was a distant aunt or godmother. "You've been here since Michael was a child, haven't you?" she said sweetly. "Would you like to say a few words?" The room went still. Evelyn froze, her heart thudded. For a second, she looked at Michael. His eyes widened, pleading silently, "Say yes, say something." But before Evelyn could speak, a shadow moved between them. Mr. Hawthorne, his voice thundered across the room like a gavel. "She's just the maid." It was louder this time, on purpose, for the whole room to hear. Gasps scattered across the tables like shattered glass. The bride's mother's smile vanished. The bride's face fell. Michael stood up from his seat, eyes blazing, but Evelyn, she didn't move, her head bowed slightly, her hands folded in front of her. Every whisper, every stare pressed against her skin. Shame curled around her like smoke. But inside, something stirred. Not pain, not fear. Something older, something she had buried years ago between changing sheets and wiping tears that didn't belong to her children. It began as a small ache in her chest. Then it grew, a pulse, a voice she had silenced for too long. The room felt smaller. The music faded to a dull echo, and for the first time in years, Evelyn lifted her head. Her eyes locked with Mr. Hawthorne, calm, unshaken, not a servant, not a victim. A woman who had nothing left to lose. Michael stood, fists trembling. The bride reached for his arm. The guests whispered, some in pity, some in shock, some in quiet admiration they didn't want to admit. Mr. Hawthorne stepped closer to Evelyn, ready to dismiss her again, to crush that spark before it became a fire. But this time, she didn't look away. And in that silent stare, something shifted in the air, like the moment right before a storm breaks. The next words spoken in that room would change everything. The plates were nearly empty, and the candles were burning low when the microphone began passing from table to table. Gold light flickered against crystal glasses. Laughter softened into tired smiles. The night was winding down, or at least that's what everyone thought. Evelyn stood near the back wall, her hands folded in front of her apron, heart pounding so loud she could hear nothing else. She had survived the ceremony, the whispers, the humiliation. She told herself all she had to do was make it to the end of the night. Then she could disappear again, quiet, unseen, but fate was not done with her yet. The microphone reached the bride. Her hand trembled slightly as she held it. Her eyes were wet, mascara just beginning to smudge at the corners. She looked around the room, then at Evelyn. Her voice came soft but steady. "Mrs. Evelyn, will you speak?" The hall went silent, utterly silent. No fork moved, no breath dared to break the tension. Evelyn looked stunned. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. And then, before she could even take a step, Mr. Hawthorne stood. "I said no," he barked, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "She has nothing to say." The words hit Evelyn like cold water. Some guests looked away, others stared, curious, hungry for drama. Michael's head turned sharply toward his father. For a second he said nothing. His jaw flexed, his breath caught. Then he stood, slowly, deliberately. His chair scraped against the marble floor, echoing like thunder in the quiet hall. "She raised me," he said, voice low but filled with something firm and unshakable. "She has more right than anyone here to speak." The air stopped moving. Even the musicians froze in their seats. The bride's hand reached for his, but she didn't pull him back. She knew nothing could stop what was coming. Evelyn looked at Michael, her eyes wide with disbelief, pain, love, everything at once. Mr. Hawthorne stared at his son, a storm building behind his eyes. But before he could speak, Evelyn did something no one expected. She stepped forward. Her steps were small, careful, but each one felt like thunder to those watching. Her hands were shaking, her breath catching in her chest. When she finally reached the center of the room, the microphone was trembling in her grip. She didn't look at Mr. Hawthorne. She didn't look at the guests. She kept her eyes somewhere in the distance, past the chandeliers, past the flowers, past the life she never lived. Her voice came soft at first, fragile but rich with truth. "I was told not to speak tonight," she said, "but silence has cost me too much in this life." The room inhaled as one. She swallowed, steadying herself. "I came into this house when I was 27. I thought it would be for a year, maybe two, just enough to make money and go home to my little boy." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "But I stayed. I stayed when they needed someone to tie little shoes, to hold shaking hands during thunderstorms, to wipe tears no one else had time to see." She looked at Michael then. His eyes were already red. "I loved this boy like he was mine. Even when it wasn't my name, he called me in front of others. Even when I stood in the shadows while he stood in the light." A murmur rippled across the tables. People shifted in their seats. Some lifted their hands to their mouths, but Evelyn didn't stop. Her voice grew steadier, stronger. I lost my own son, she said, and the world stopped breathing. He was 7 when he got sick. I was here rocking this family's child to sleep while my own was calling for me. Her fingers tightened around the microphone. Her eyes glistened, but the tears did not fall. He died that night, and I wasn't there to hold him. I missed his last breath because I was too busy making sure this house stayed perfect. A gasp rippled through the guests. Someone in the back began to cry softly. Michael covered his mouth with his hand, horror in his eyes. The bride's mother stared at her lap, clutching her napkin, but Evelyn breathed, slow and controlled. I missed birthdays, I missed funerals, I missed pieces of myself I'll never get back. But I stayed because I loved this boy, she nodded gently toward Michael, even when he forgot who loved him first. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive, the kind that made people see themselves for who they truly were. Evelyn's eyes drifted to Mr. Hawthorne. His face was hard, but there was something cracking in his eyes, something he fought to hide. Regret, shame, maybe guilt, maybe too late. Evelyn lowered the microphone slightly, but her voice didn't waver. I don't say this to shame anyone. I say it because I spent my life quiet, obedient, invisible, and all it gave me was grief. So tonight I speak. She glanced around the room, at the chandeliers, the flowers, the people who never once said thank you, not because I want applause, but because I want to live the rest of my days with my head up. No one clapped, no one moved. Tears rolled down cheeks hidden behind diamonds. Even the waiters stopped working. Michael stepped closer to her, tears streaming freely now. His voice broke. I'm sorry, he whispered. Mama Eve, I'm so sorry. She reached out, gently touched his cheek, a soft smile. I know, baby, I know. Behind them, Mr. Hawthorne stood still. For the first time in his life, he had no words. His lips parted, then closed. His power, his pride, none of it could stop the truth that now filled the room like light after a long night. And just when it felt like the world might breathe again, Evelyn swayed. One hand reached for the table, her knees buckled slightly. Michael caught her just before she fell. Gasps echoed from every side. The bride stood up, her dress rustling like wind. Mr. Hawthorne took one hesitant step forward, then stopped, unsure, trembling. The night of silence had turned into a night of truth. But the price of truth had only just begun. The room was still. No music, no clinking glasses, not even a whisper. Just the sound of Evelyn breathing as the microphone slipped from her fingers and hung loosely at her side. No one clapped, no one dared, but tears were everywhere. The bride's veil glistened with them. Old uncles wiped their eyes with trembling hands. Even the waiters, who had seen countless rich people's celebrations, stood frozen, their chests heavy. And then, slowly, Michael stood from his seat. His steps were soft, hesitant, like a child walking barefoot across broken glass. When he reached her, he didn't say her name. He didn't care about the stairs. He simply knelt at her feet. This billionaire groom in his silk suit, bowing before the woman his father tried to erase. His voice cracked as he whispered, I'm sorry. The words barely left his throat before he broke. His shoulders shook, his eyes red, his hands gripping Evelyn's work-worn fingers as if they were his only anchor. Evelyn looked down at him, her face soft, lined with years of pain and love. She didn't pull away. She didn't tell him to stand. Instead, she laid her other hand on his head like she used to when he was just a boy crying after a scraped knee. I know, she whispered. I know, baby. The bride stepped forward next. Her heels clicked gently against the floor, but her voice was barely a breath. She knelt beside her husband and wrapped her arms around Evelyn's waist. Thank you, she whispered, for loving him when no one else did. Evelyn's hand trembled as it touched the young woman's cheek, brushing away a tear that wasn't hers, but somehow felt like it belonged to them both. Then something no one expected happened. One by one, guests began to stand, not for Michael, not for the bride, not for the billionaire sitting like a statue at the head of the table. They stood for Evelyn, for the woman who served them drinks, who folded napkins and cleaned crystal glasses. They didn't clap. They just stood, silently, heads bowed slightly, hands in front of them like a quiet prayer. Only one man stayed seated, Mr. Hawthorne, his jaw clenched. His fingers tapped angrily on the tablecloth. He looked around, confused, then angry, then something else, something softer, something he did not recognize. Evelyn turned her eyes to him. There was no bitterness there, no hatred, just a tired kind of truth. She spoke, her voice calm but strong. "You taught me silence." Her eyes didn't waver. "But your son taught me dignity." The words struck deeper than any slap could. The room felt the shift. The power he held over her for decades broke like thin ice beneath the sun. Mr. Hawthorne opened his mouth, maybe to deny, maybe to defend, but nothing came out. His voice, once so sharp, so sure, failed him. For the first time, he was the one who felt small. Michael rose to his feet slowly. He took the microphone from the floor, his hands still trembling, but his voice steady now. "This woman," he said, turning to face the crowd, "is my family." He looked at his father. "She raised me. She loved me when nobody else would. From tonight forward, she will never be called just the maid again." A hush fell over the room. Not silence, respect. Real, quiet, heavy respect that doesn't need clapping or cheering. The kind that sits in your bones and makes you look at yourself differently. People lowered their eyes, not in shame, but in understanding. Mr. Hawthorne sat there, shoulders heavy. His throat moved like he was trying to swallow something too large for his pride. Evelyn didn't wait for an apology that might never come. She just gave him one last look, soft but unbreakable. Then she turned away. The band didn't start playing again. No one rushed to restart the party. Instead, the night shifted. People approached Evelyn, not with pity, but with open hands. Some whispered thank you. Others simply touched her shoulder, too full of emotion to speak. The bride's mother hugged her long and tight, silent tears soaking into Evelyn's uniform. Even the chef came from the kitchen, hat in hand, nodding respectfully. The night wasn't remembered for the golden centerpieces or the imported roses, not for the expensive champagne or the perfectly tailored tuxedos. It was remembered for a woman with tired hands and a worn-out heart who stood in a room full of power and finally spoke. And the world listened. Later the hall emptied. Moonlight dripped through the tall windows. Evelyn stood outside by the garden fountains, breathing in the cold night air. Her hands no longer shook. Her chest felt lighter, like she had set down a weight she forgot she was carrying. Michael walked out and stood beside her. No words, just quiet. Then, softly, he said, "You're not alone anymore." She looked at him, tears gently resting on her lashes, not from pain this time, but from release. "I never wanted riches," she said. "Just respect, just kindness." Michael nodded, his voice breaking. "You have it, from me, from her, from everyone who matters." Behind them, in the glowing light of the wedding hall, Mr. Hawthorne stood alone by the window. His reflection looked unfamiliar. Older, smaller, he watched Evelyn and his son, hands buried in his pockets, and for the first time in his life, he looked sorry. The night ended without music, without applause, but with something greater. A soft truth settling over everyone like a warm blanket over cold shoulders. That money can buy silence, but it can never bury truth. That respect is not given by wealth, it is earned by the heart. And that sometimes the most powerful voice in a room is the one that has been quiet the longest. And long after the lights dimmed and the guests drove home, people whispered about that night. Not about the bride's dress, not about the billionaire's speeches, but about her, the maid who wasn't a maid anymore, the woman who found her voice and made the world listen.